trip to Africa, and I'm delighted that I was able to start my trip in Uganda.
I'm delighted that you gave us the opportunity to host you.
It's a pleasure.
All right. Next to Ms. Bhatia is Perry Aritua, who is a lawyer and women's rights activist and the executive director of the Women's Democracy Network Uganda chapter. Perry currently serves on the board of Uganda Women's Network, where she represents the Uganda Association of Women Lawyers and serves as the vice chairperson of UWONET. Welcome, Perry.
Thank you, Josephine, and good evening, viewers.
Great. And next to me is Tina Musuya, who is not a visitor here. Tina is one of the most acclaimed violence against women and girls activists in Uganda. She is the executive director of Center for Domestic Violence Prevention, CEDOVIP, and under her guidance, CEDOVIP won the 2010 UNAIDS Red Ribbon Award for innovative work in preventing violence against women and HIV. Welcome, Tina.
Thank you. Good evening, Josephine.
All right.
I'm happy to be here.
It's good to have you. It's good to have all of you. Let's say it as it is. Joining us, we're coming to you, like I said before, from the Kampala Serena Conference Center, Nile Room. And just to set the stage for our conversation, I did a little reading that says that the women's movement is a series of political campaigns for reforms on issues such as reproductive rights, domestic violence, maternity leave, equal pay, women's suffrage, sexual harassment, and sexual violence. Would this describe the movement, the conversation that we're going to have today?
Yes, it does.
Do you want to add or take away from what this definition is?
I'll just add, it's usually there's collective action, and that collective action is geared towards what you've just elaborated.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so when we say women's movement, just each of you, from where you come from, where you sit, what does that look like for you?
Well, from where I'm sitting, which is currently New York, but having a global perspective, what the movement looks like is a mobilization of unparalleled consequence, because it has been 25 years since the Beijing Declaration of 1995, and yet we have such a huge unfinished agenda on all of the aspects that you mentioned. So what the women's movement today looks like is Me Too, Time's Up, Hear Me Now, Equality Now. We are seeing an unprecedented mobilization across the world from women of all backgrounds, class, caste, creed, and economic status.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I sit and live in Uganda. At times, the women's movement cannot, most people have misinterpreted it to be NGOs, but for us, it's not just NGOs. These are individuals, these are groups who believe in equality for women, they believe in justice, they believe in inclusiveness, and they also believe that women should have equal rights with men and equal opportunities. So you can't define it as a group of NGOs. There are many who will come and go, and many of us define it, you know, like a car, where others will come, others will go. But the cause remains the same. At the end of the day, we want to see girls and women having the same rights and enjoying equal opportunities like the male colleagues.
Right. Tina?
In my perspective, of course, this is about everyday organizing and challenging. And when we say it's everyday organizing, it's that every person, women, men, and you know, everyone igniting their agency to challenge the status quo. You see, there's so much social injustice to the extent that everyone thinks that this is normal for women. But the women's movement and organizing is about challenging, you know, getting people to critical thinking, to really see that things are not okay. We have to scratch them from their comfort zones to make sure that they just don't give women peanuts, but we hold them accountable. We challenge and demand, and I'm happy to say we demand. We just don't beg.
When I was, every time I start to say the word women in any room, very quickly somebody will throw in the word feminist, and they throw it in such a way that it seems like such a dirty word, like it's a dirty thing, it's very unattractive. Why is that, do you think? I know that when we're talking about the women's movement, feminism comes in. But why is it that it feels like it's a dirty thing now?
So I will speak, and my colleagues can add. Feminism, for everyone out there, is the belief and the practice where we are creating space where men and women are valued equally. They are perceived as people of equal worth and value, and therefore we must do deliberate things to make sure that we raise the profile of women. It's not about, you know, tilting the stage, but it's about getting men and women at par so that they have equal rights, just not in books but in practice, equal opportunity, they're treated fairly, they're paid, you know, equal pay, equal opportunities, and they can fully participate and achieve their full potential. That's feminism.
I think you're right that feminism is no longer a beautiful word. And I think it's because there is a big pushback globally against women's rights. We are seeing this everywhere. There is, surprisingly, even though there has been so much progress, at the same time a real backlash, and we are seeing in many countries what we call a rollback of women's rights. So I think that's one of the reasons why feminism is not a word that is loved by all. And I think to combat this kind of discrimination and this kind of pushback, we really need to have a global pushback against the pushback. That's what the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, has called for, and we really need people all over the world to join the movement to create pushback against the pushback.
Josephine, whenever you challenge power, there will be pushback, because there are people who have enjoyed power for years. So when you're saying, let's share the cake, many people who hold power are not going to be comfortable, whether it's in your personal or private space, whether it's in politics, whether it's in economy, whether it's in the social sector, there's going to be a pushback, you know. So it's about challenging unfairness, you know. Okay. And I think if everyone understood it that way, we would stop putting feminism as this dirty word that must not be touched, because it's about saying we are created equal, let's have equal opportunities to the national cake, particularly in Uganda.
Well, Ms. Patia said something, and you started to talk about the importance of the women's movement in your response on feminism. But I would like to hear from the rest of you on why this is important, this movement. What is the aim of it?
So, as you can see, humanity is a whole piece of development. I call it social development. And if we have to get to where we are heading to, both men and women have to equally participate, and as Perry said, equally benefit from whatever we have. So with this women's movement, you know, with all this historical gender inequality, women have been unfortunately oppressed, and they've been discriminated against and not shared equally on all the opportunities on this globe. So with this women's movement, we are correcting historical wrongs, and the historical wrongs demand that people understand that patriarchy is a system of oppression that has caused a lot of problems for us. So we are working to fix the historical injustice. So with this organizing, I'll quickly mention a few benefits that are very clear-cut for people. It's because of women's organizing that women are looked at as full human beings. They can also vote, stand for political offices. Now you can see our constitution, how gender sensitive it is. It defines here in Uganda that men and women are of equal worth and value. Therefore, they must participate. And because of this, we've seen a rise of women also coming into leadership positions. We've seen more girls coming to achieve education. We've seen laws being revised, because even the laws, women and men were not equal under the law. We've seen laws also redefined to make sure that women and men are treated equally under the law. And also when it comes to employment, women and men should be paid the same for the same job, because there's no reason as to why we do the same job and because I'm female I get less. No. That's not right.
Usually the argument is you're going to take maternity leave for 3 months or maybe 6 months or even a month. Or you're going to have lots of sick days because you have a child to take care of.
And that's the very reason as to why women should be even given more, because they are playing a very important function of being, you know, mothers, continuity of life. But unfortunately they are being punished. And of course that's a gender issue altogether.
Ms. Batio, paint the picture for us for what the women's movement looks like outside of Uganda.
I'll do that in a minute, but I just want to build on something that Tina said, and that is that I think when you look at this issue of, you know, why, the why is really grounded in something very fundamental that all of us care about, which is human rights. It is a human right for women to be treated equally as men. And the second thing is, if you look at what the world has committed to, which is the Sustainable Development Goals, and this wonderful lofty vision of having shared peace and prosperity by 2030, how on earth are we going to achieve those if half of the population is not given an opportunity and is not given equal access? So in the end, it is actually fundamentally quite simple. It's about human rights, it is about opportunity, and it is about economic development for all, so that everybody can be better off. But coming to your question on what the global movement looks like, I think it has two almost contradictory aspects. The first is that you are seeing a lot more mobilization. All across the world, you are seeing women marching, you are seeing a greater participation by, as you said, women and girls and young people demanding rights. So that is wonderful to see, and actually social media has had a huge and very important influence on the ability to mobilize. But at the same time, the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde piece of this is that, on the other hand, you see groups whose power is being challenged, who are pushing back. So actually the women's movement today is both opportunity and challenge. It is not a simple picture. It is a very complex picture, but it is a picture which requires all of us who work in the movement to do even more than we might have been doing 10 years ago.
Just to add one small thing to what Tina already said. A lot of the discussions that used to be private about inequality have been put into the public sphere. You know, discussions on reproductive rights, discussions on the importance of unpaid care work. Most people are actually fretting and saying, why should women be paid, you know, for work that they say is traditionally women's work, you know. So those are discussions which women and men who believe in justice and equality are bringing to the fore. So for me, these discussions then challenge governments to ensure that where they have not been putting resources must be put, you know. So that's the important role that the women's movement brings in that things that used to be swept under the carpet are being brought to the fore. Discussions on sexual violence. You look at the report of the Uganda Demographic Health Survey of 2016. Sexual violence is still at 22% for females between 15 and 49. It's unacceptable. Now, if we do not challenge, you know, our society, if we do not challenge social norms, then some of these things become a norm, and they are not norms. So that's why the women's movement is important. It asks questions, and it also gives alternatives. That's why you'll find, particularly the women in civil society organizations, doing research, documenting practices that must be changed, but also sharing models that work, so that society understands that this is not normal. You cannot, you know, deny girls an opportunity to have equal rights with boys just because they were born female. We don't choose whether we should be born male or female.
All right. Yeah. So from the examples that you've given, we clearly see that this is happening in Uganda. But what does the movement look like here, back home? What are the things that the women are doing that we can put a finger to and say, this is what we're doing and trying to change things? So, in just 2 minutes, because we're going to take a break.
So quickly, the women are doing many things, formally and informally, because when we talk about organizing, it's people in the civil society. It's not only about NGOs, but women at the grassroots, women in the private sector and informal sector are all coming together, and even women in leadership and political spaces are coming together to have like critical thinking about what's the situation of women, like what is going wrong and what is it that needs to be done, and then they hold whoever is responsible accountable and keep demanding for change.
It's been a process, just 1 minute. It's been a process. The women's movement did not begin yesterday. It began right before the before the colonial period. There are a number of things that the women's movement have done, ensuring that women have the rights to participate in elections. It was as far as the Lancaster discussions, you know, those were in the 1960s, getting women to be in positions of leadership so that other women could understand that it is okay for women to be in those positions. But also you look at our constitution. You know, at times people think, oh, Uganda has a good constitution. It did not come on a silver plate. Women's voices were included because women in civil society organizations worked with women who were going to the CA to ensure that these issues were integrated into our constitution. You look at the National Gender Policy, the Equal Opportunities Commission. These commissions did not just drop. Women's organizing was important in ensuring that these institutions are established so that we continue to monitor inequality and also demand for better opportunities for both men and women.
Okay. Yes.
I think there's one really interesting development of the last 30 years, and that is the women's movement is very important, but gender equality and women's empowerment is no longer an issue just for women. And you are increasingly seeing men and boys champion this cause. When you look at the number of governments in the world which have said they have a feminist foreign policy, I mean, there are not many, but there are a few. And then you look at people who are in positions of power, heads of government, who have said we are going to have gender equal cabinets. They're all men who are making sure that 50% of the women, 50% of the cabinet is actually women. And the other, I think, very notable thing, which absolutely did not exist, you know, when I first started working in development, is that the private sector is playing a very important role in this, because companies now realize that actually to be good corporate citizens, it is very important for them to be sensitive to gender concerns and to make sure that their employees are paid equally if they're men and women. Of course, not everybody's doing that yet, but the fact that you have the UN Global Compact, which is signed by major corporations worldwide, and that you increasingly see the private sector even here talking about gender equality and women's empowerment, is unprecedented. So that's something that I think we should recognize, acknowledge, celebrate, but ask for more.
Right. I know that we have the gender equality seal. I'm not sure how many countries have signed up now. When you're about 30, I'm not sure though. But I think that's a major step.
So, you know, the gender seal is an important tool, if you will. UN Women has a tool called Women's Economic Empowerment Principles. And basically this is a way for companies to sign up and to show through very specific concrete actions that they actually are walking the talk on gender equality. So, you know, anybody can stand up and say, I'm a gender champion, but you have to walk the talk. Are you paying the women equally? Are you making sure that when you're building infrastructure and you're building toilets, that you're thinking about women's toilets? Are you making sure that you have policies that allow women to take leave and allow men to take leave so that the burden of care does not fall just on women? So there are a host of ways in which companies and the private sector can show their commitment to this agenda. This agenda is a global and a universal agenda. It does not belong only to civil society. It does not belong only to government. It does not belong only to the private sector. It belongs to everyone.
Everybody. All right. Thank you very much. Let's take a short break and we'll be right back. Thank you for staying with us. We're coming to you from the Kampala Serena Conference Center, Nile Room. And again, like I said at the beginning, our conversation tonight is on the women's movement, and we're looking at the opportunities and challenges there within. Before we continue with our conversation with the panelists, I thought we'd open it up to the floor just to hear what the rest of studio audience is thinking. We'll start with you, yes?
Good evening, everyone.
All right, good evening.
It's Mariam Chirabo, the Guild leads Gender Ethics and Integrity Macquarie Students Guild. And mine is basically on two things. The women's movement has really concentrated on women, of course, because it's the women's movement. But then I'm saying, are you preparing the men for the women that we are grooming, that we want to groom? You see, they have grown up in a culture where women are supposed to be inferior to them. And they have grown up knowing, I'll take for example, he's sitting on the couch and his sister is doing everything in the house. So are we training the men to receive those feminist women that we're grooming? And the second thing is about the corporate responsibility. Yes, the corporations have really been instrumental in helping the feminist cause. But however, the recent Me Too movement, we've seen a number of corporations, they claim that it has become now risky to have women because they're afraid of sexual harassment claims, either false. And could you comment on those two? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll just take a response to that before we move on.
So, thank you very much for those questions. They are really powerful. Now, for us as feminists, because we are working to transform the world, it is transforming. We engage both men and women because they all must, unlearn what they've known and relearn new values and ways of treating each other. So, yes, we do work with both men and women in our individual programs. Right now, we are not talking so much about it, but we definitely do.
Okay.
Thank you. I agree. It was a great question. And I think this issue of addressing norms and people's stereotypes and attitudes and behaviors is really critical. And actually, it's critical both for men and women, because sometimes actually women also have anti-women stereotypes and norms. So you have to address everybody. And the notion that you can change a mind is a very powerful notion, but it has to be done through either early childhood education. You start young. You have to influence, because people pick up values first and foremost in the family unit, because that's the first place they know. So everything actually depends on what you see at home and what role models you have growing up. That is really important. The other thing that's really important is you have to try to change people's mindsets. And so, for example, we work with advertising companies. We want to address the issue of toxic masculinity. We want to show that it's actually, you can be a very powerful man if you empower women. So we have to have good examples, you have to have case studies, and you have to have advertising companies and marketing companies willing to buy into this issue of addressing toxic masculinity from a very early age. And then your question, another very good question on the corporate, the corporate commitment today, but also the backlash. I think companies that say we're not going to hire women because we might have some sexual harassment claims are not going to stay in business for very long. It's as simple as that. You cannot be a 21st century company if you do not have progressive policies towards women and progressive policies towards all aspects of women's empowerment. So I think, yes, there might be a few, but I would say by and large what we see is that companies are actually going the other way and trying their best to be viewed as gender friendly, gender responsive. That's why there is a demand for things like the United Nations Gender Seal and the UN Women's Economic Empowerment Principles.
Does this still apply for organizations that are afraid to hire more women because they're going to take maternity leave and leave gaps in the organizations?
I think there are still, sadly, I think there are still organizations like that. And I think the more that other organizations can show through role modeling, and where employees can show by walking. The ideal world would be that the word gets out that this company doesn't hire women because they worry about the maternity leave that they're going to take, and others should boycott them and boycott their products. And people should send a signal through the market of what they believe this company's values should be. It is just like consumers today want to buy products that are made paying attention to the environment, and that is becoming so important for all companies, whether they are garment companies. Any kind of company today has to worry about its environmental footprint. Similarly, companies today have to worry about their gender footprint.
All right. The next comment.
Thank you very much. My name is Maxime Winato. I'm the representative of UN Women in Uganda. Just a couple of comments related to the pushback that was referred to earlier. In order to follow the recommendation from the Secretary General of the UN that says we need to push back the pushback, we have done a study to scan a little bit the women's movement in Africa and zooming particularly on Uganda. And we have had these two series of challenges faced by the women's movement, including internal challenges and external ones. And quickly, The two internal challenges that we've seen, one is value, like the value in the women's movement, is the women's movement keeping its value, and the second one is movement building, the capacity of the women's movement to regenerate itself, to capture the young girls, to capture issues that are relevant at different circles. But among the external ones, I will talk about just two. One is the shrinking of the political space for women. Women, even that are elected in position of decision, are they more in that position than representing the women? If a woman is an MP or a minister, is she more a minister than a woman? Or is she more an MP than a woman? Like voting along party lines rather than voting along women's rights platform. The second one is legislation. We have seen positive legislation in Uganda that has not been implemented. So externally, women face that pushback where men in position, whether it's in the community, whether it's the police, whether it's the hospital, whether it's at the justice sector, that are not doing what Uganda has decided to do in terms of legislation. We have seen sentences of 3 months for rape, which means that the judge is now putting into that sentence his own conviction that is against the legislation. So when the director was talking about what men can do, those are windows of opportunities for men who want to contribute to Uganda's vision of equality, wherever they are, the contribution that they can make. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maxime. One of the questions that I was going to come to later on was, do we have the structures in place that support the work that is being undertaken by the women's movements? And I think that points to what he was talking about. But we're going to come to that later on. Let's just take another comment from the audience. Yes?
Thank you so much. My name is Grace Ruanga. I work with Center for Domestic Violence Prevention. Like when the panelists were presenting,
Grace, could I ask you to move here because the light might interfere?
Okay. I kept on reflecting. At 23 years, I joined the women's movement. That was in the year 2000. And at that time, we started on the subject of domestic violence, right down in the communities. And at that time, the LCs, the cultural leaders, will tell us, before this woman makes her decision, have you consulted the husband? Yet at that time, this was a woman who has been cut. And even the police would say, please, we need to ask the man what makes him happy. So when I reflect back, I'm like, the whole question of working with boys and men, we've worked with them all throughout. I don't know why people have fear. And I have experience where we brought many men on board and they spoiled everything. Today, if you ask me, the men, that time we used to call them male changers. Today, where are they? Change agent structure, today, where are they?
What do you mean when you say they spoiled everything?
Like here in the public, they would be for women and girls. But when they go back in the community, in the workplaces, they are like, you know, women can never change us because we have our strong cultural values and norms we have to adhere to. So for me, in my view, I think working with men is very good. But to the women's movement, at what level do we engage the men? Because I now see in many spaces, you find even women saying, no, you people, you are favoring women. There is no favoring. It's our human rights and it is women's rights. And as far as I know, women's rights are human rights. Then again, the corporate women, the middle class women, even women in the rural areas who are engaging into economic empowerment, the abuse. Up to today, you still hear comments like, I allowed you to work, so I cannot find beans at the dining. I need meat, a beer, and a cigarette. So you ask, where are we going? Look at the corporate women. The space for corporate women to report the violence they go through is not there. We dilly-dally within the social network, And even when you reach out to say, okay, can we give you support? No, what will society think? So again, we need the support.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Does anyone want to respond to that before we take a break? Just very quickly.
Just one. You know, what she says is true, because we do work with the local councillors. One of the things we did deliberately was to first have a safe space for women, to talk about some of the challenges they are facing as women councillors in the local councils before bringing the men on board, because it's important to bring the men. Many of them hold positions of power. If you want to influence the speaker in most districts, it's a man. The LC5s, most are men. We only have 3 women who are LC5 chairpersons. So it's important to first create that space for the women, but we have no option. To be able to achieve equal opportunity, you have to bring the men on board, but you also have to do an assessment. Where are the women at the stage where you bring in the men? That for me is critical. But the other thing also is, and I think Ms. Batia mentioned it, is to start when they are young. And that's why our curriculum, we need to review some of the things we teach our children. Yes. You know, the division of roles. You still read in our curriculum where they say girls, mother cooks, boy, I don't know what the boy does. You know, so when the children go to school and they have been exposed to a different context, the curriculum will mark them wrong, because that's what is said, you know.
And well, again, like she says, it starts from home.
Yeah, so we must focus on how we nurture our boys and girls. We must work on the curriculum so that by the time they go to school, it is in their context. Right now, some of their context is different from the curriculum.
And quickly to add on that, let's not just assume that because people are graduates, they are PhD holders and so on, they believe in the equality of men and women.
That's
no,
right.
That's very wrong. So whomever, whether they're in civil society or what, because they never undergo this kind of transformative training in school, we need to have get them to the basics. Whether they're graduates of gender or human rights, let's take them through, you know, a process of transforming them, both men and women, so that they believe in the values, the new values, and they're happy, you know, to live by those values.
All right, thank you very much, ladies. Let's take another quick break and we'll be right back. Welcome back. Thank you for staying with us. We're coming to you from the Kampala Serena Conference Center Nile Room, and we're talking tonight about the women's movement, and we're looking at the opportunities and challenges. I'll just very quickly give an opportunity to 2 audience members. Just quickly, we'll take the first, either question or comment.
Mine is a comment. Thank you very much. I would like to start from the perspective of the movement.
Could we know your name first, though?
My name is Florence
Yes.
Butegwa. I'm an independent gender expert and consultant. Many people like to think of the women's movement as something happening out there. It's independent and so on, but actually in Uganda, the government recognizes the women's movement and the broader civil society as very important partners in development. If you look at our vision 2040, you look at the national plan, development plan, you look at the NGO policy, most of the policies recognize the particular and very specialist skill sets that the movement has, and the government and other development partners rely a lot, draw a lot on the women's movement for training the police officers, for training the judicial officers, for training civil servants and senior managers, including parliamentarians. So it's an important contribution that the movement has made in the country's development, to find that a lot of the policy discourse now will include elements of gender equality, awareness, and women's rights.
All right, I'm just going to cut you short because our time is very quickly spent. We'll just take one more comment from somebody else, and then we can wrap up on this side.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
My name is Angela Nakafero. I serve as the Commissioner, Gender and Women Affairs, Minister of Gender and Labour Social Development. I also wanted to take on to Florence really the women's movement in Uganda has played a critical role in law formulation of policies and programs. We've worked closely with the women's movement. Tina and Petra know exactly what happens. There is no policy or program that passes by the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development without the participation of the women's movement. I think our area has been, the challenge has been the effective implementation of whatever we agree upon. And of course, for me, I believe this is a shared responsibility. There's also somebody who talked about the curriculum.
All right, just very quickly.
Really, change has to start from the family. Yeah. By the time the child comes to school, already there are certain values and practices already instilled in that child. We've worked so hard in terms of transforming the curriculum. I would want to assure you that a lot has changed. But of course, more work really remains to be done, but a lot has been done. So can we support each other right from the family, from age 1, age 0, to ensure that we transform the values and norms in our family? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And in relation to that, and I guess it takes us to what we're going to talk about with Maxime on the structures that are supporting the work that has been undertaken or the work that is being undertaken. If any of you wants to comment on that very quickly.
One, of course, has been government, as Angela has rightly said, because without having the legal and policy framework, it's very difficult for any organization to do its work. So the government structures have been very key in terms of legal and policy. The other structure which is now coming on board, though slowly, and very important, is the cultural and religious institutions. You know, there's been an attempt by the women's movement to work with them because they have influence in the community and even at national level. So that is work in progress. And the challenge, I think, has been resourcing for the women's movement to do its work, because to do the research, to do the capacity building, to ensure that the movement continues to grow, you need resources. And I must say, sadly, the women's rights organizations, when you look at the enormous contribution they make, are one of the least funded civil society organizations in this country. But despite that, as the audience has rightly alluded, we do a lot of work. And I think that is an area that different, not only donors, but the community, for me, is the biggest resource, should continue to support. Because once they're open to changing their minds, to changing their attitudes, then our work becomes easier.
All right. Do we think that this, when a lot of the complaints that you see online about feminism and women and all of these things, it's usually the elite, the people that are on the social media platforms. Does it ever feel that the struggle is for the elite, for the women that are on these platforms? What are the women at the grassroots doing that we don't recognize?
So, unfortunately, some of the very, I would say, powerful activists are off the social media platform. But even though they are not being seen online, they are doing a lot of work, transformative work, within their neighborhoods. And they are the ones raising the largest population of Ugandans, boys and girls out there. A lot is happening there at the household level, at the community level, and in schools. So, as you were rightly saying, some of those comments you see is part of the backlash, and that's the biggest challenge. One of the biggest challenges that we are facing. There's different forms of backlash, whereby they are trying to silence the voices of the ones who are speaking up. That said, it is also another indicator that we are really scratching them, and we are getting there. Yes. And we need to innovate and keep going, because nothing comes easy. And when they resist, we go deep and it sinks in.
All right, and we're wrapping up, so I don't know where I'm going to start from, but I would like, in your final comments, each of you, to tell us, how do we strengthen this movement going forward? Where are the opportunities? Where do we start from?
So, I will go.
Okay,
yes.
so we'll just go.
We already have achievements. We need to use the achievements that we have, because we have the legal framework, and we have a willing population for us to get there. Everyone in here and out there wants to see men and women really treated equally. The backlash on the side shouldn't silence us. So we can build on that, and that means everyday activism, do something in your house, with your peers, with your friends, plus the broader organizing, and we shall get there.
For me, it's about ensuring that in our work, we integrate movement building. Wherever we go, we are able to ensure that the voices that are being raised at the grassroots level get the national attention that they require. And that's why the so-called elite women become very important, because we're here in this space. At times the things that happen there can only reach here if we speak. You know, the other is to get more young people, more young women to continue this mantle, because our history shows that the number of women, some of them deceased right now, like the late Sarah and T. Rose, you know, who really did a lot for this country in terms of ensuring that the women's voices are heard in parliament when they were members of parliament. So it's important that we continue to nurture, we continue to mentor, particularly the young boys and girls, to see that we all win when we treat each other equally. Thank you.
Thank you, Perry. And
I would say three things. First of all, implementation, implementation, implementation. As we just heard from the audience, not just in Uganda but worldwide, there are lots of good policies on the books. There are lots of good laws on the books. But then why are there so many young women still being married off, you know, before the age of 18? That's because implementation of the law doesn't take place. So we have to demand more accountability for implementation. The second is there has to be a much greater sense of urgency from all. Why in the 21st century are there still these unprecedented levels of violence against women and rape? This is not a normal thing, and yet I don't see enough people screaming about the need for change. Yes, there are some of us whose work it is who are doing this, but why aren't more people outraged? So I think there has to be a much greater sense of outrage and a greater sense of urgency. And finally, I completely agree with you. Young people are going to save us. Look at what's happening on climate change. Who would have ever thought that the accountability for the world on climate change would be given by a 16-year-old young activist from Sweden? So I'm waiting for the Greta Thunberg on gender, and I think it's going to emerge somewhere. We don't have it quite yet, but I think young people play a fundamental role, and I think they are going to help drive this movement in a way that certainly old people like me haven't yet figured out.
All right, well, thank you so much, ladies. Our time is fast spent. Thank you so much, Ms. Bhatia, Perry, and Tina, for taking the time to speak with us, and thank you to our studio audience for participating and making this conversation what it was. Well, that brings us to the end of our show for tonight. This same show will be on our social media platforms, but coming up is NTV Weekend Edition with Sandra Twinorio.